A woman I know tells about her 5-year-old son playing in his first neighborhood softball game. The little guy named Frankie stepped up to the plate while his dad shouted instructions from the sidelines. Mom and Dad cheered excitedly when Frankie clouted the ball well into right field. Charged with excitement, the youngster scampered around first base and rounded second. Then, confused by all of the shouting, he hesitated on third base and seemed not to know what to do next. "Run home, Frankie," his dad screamed, wanting desperately to see him score. "Run home!" With that, Frankie turned, scooted across left field, squeezed through the fence, and disappeared. They found him later sitting in the kitchen of the family home. Well, Frankie did just as his dad instructed him to do. His father yelled, "Run home," and that's exactly what he did. His father needed to be a little clearer, perhaps, in what he was directing him to do. Faced with a similar situation, my dad gave me instructions in my first Little League game. I had played pickup games with the kids before, but now I was playing on the boys' team. I was up at bat, and my dad told me to swing as hard as I could. He was afraid that I wouldn't hit the ball far enough. Well, I listened to what Dad did, and on that first pitch, I swung just as hard as I possibly could, and lo and behold, the bat hit the ball. Now, I had put my all into that swing, and I watched the ball. I stood there at home plate and watched the ball go out over the heads of the first and second baseman and leave the infield. Then I heard Dad yelling, "Run, run!" So I started to move, watching all the while as the ball went out into the outfield and over the heads of the outfielders and over the little fence at the end of the lot and right through a neighbor's picture window. My dad said, "We probably don't want to tell your mother about this." And he got the window fixed. But in both cases, there were little ones playing ball and following directions. Frankie ran home and I swung hard. The directions seemed clear. They seemed simple. Maybe you're familiar with that little acronym KISS. It means keep it simple, stupid. I suspect that saying would have helped in those baseball games. I suspect that saying would have helped many preachers today. Keep it simple, stupid. Paul keeps it simple in today's epistle lesson. He tells us that the cross is the power of God. The cross changes everything. The message of the cross is one of salvation and life. It's the most powerful message that the world has ever known. It's a message that transforms us and makes us new, if only we would accept it. It's like a humble couple who had only recently dedicated themselves to Christ. They were good people, but they had a weakness. They were illiterate. They could not read at all. However, they didn't allow this limitation to keep them from becoming involved in Christ's community. They met on a regular basis with a group of other believers. Now, all of these other believers dressed alike while they were working on a certain project. The men all wore red shirts. So the woman made a red shirt for her husband. He came home after the next meeting, however, with a look of disappointment on his face, because the other men had a message printed on their shirts, but he didn't. Of course, he had absolutely no idea what the message said, since he couldn't read. But it bothered him that his shirt didn't have a message on it. His wife, undaunted by her inability to read, decided to sew a message on his shirt as well. She chose 3 words, which she copied carefully from a sign in the store window across the street. Neither she nor her husband knew what the words meant, but he wore his brightly lettered shirt to the next meeting. Afterwards, he came home bubbling with joy. He said all of the men really liked the inscription because it described the wonderful change they had seen in his life. It turned out that his wife had sewn under these words, these 3 words that she'd seen on a store, and she put them on her husband's shirt. What were the 3 words? Under new management. Under new management. I guess that says it all. Since they had met Christ, their lives were under new management. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to testify to the power of God in your life. If Christ has touched you, healed you, given you a reason to go on, if you are under new management, let us say, then tell the story to others. Tell it plainly. Tell it simply, so no one can misunderstand. The church at Corinth had been charged with telling that message, but they were losing the message. They had become a church not known for the message of Christ, but known for conflict. They were famous for harsh verbal battles, face slapping, and fist fighting. And I mean that literally. Can you imagine going to a church where people yelled at each other, slapped each other in the face, and fought with their fists? That's what had happened to the church at Corinth. And I'd like to just add as a side note, it's to that church with all of its fighting that Paul writes that famous chapter on love. He writes it into a church with a lot of problems. A church that had lost the meaning and the power of the cross. They had forgotten who they were, and they had forgotten whose they were, that they belonged to God. Our Jewish friends are wonderful storytellers, and they often tell the following stories. During a service at an old synagogue in Eastern Europe, when the prayer was said, half of the congregation stood up and half remained seated. The half that was sitting started yelling at those standing up to sit down, and the ones who were standing yelled at those who were sitting to stand up. The rabbi, educated as he was in the law and commentaries, didn't know what to do. The congregation suggested that he consult a 98-year-old housebound fella who was one of the original founders of the temple. The rabbi hoped the elderly man could tell him what the actual tradition was. Was the temple tradition to sit or to stand for the important prayer? So he went to the nursing home with a representative from the sitters and a representative from the standers. The one whose followers stood during the prayer said to the old man, "Is the tradition to stand during prayer?" The old man answered, "No, that is not the tradition." The one whose followers sat asked, "Is a tradition to sit?" The old man answered, "No, that's not the tradition." But the rabbi said to the old man, "They fight all the time. They yell at each other about weather." And the old man interrupted, exclaiming, "That is the tradition." The tradition was to yell at each other. Such was the church at Corinth. And here's that other bit of Jewish humor. The Jewish school, Yeshiva University, decided to field a crew team. Unfortunately, they lost race after race after race. They practiced for hours a day, but never managed to come in any better than dead last. The head of the university finally decided to send one of the team members to spy on the Harvard rowing team. So he shipped off to Cambridge and hid in the bulrushes off the Charles River, from where he carefully watched the Harvard team as they practiced. The young man finally returned to Yeshiva. "I've figured out their secret," he announced. "They have 8 guys rowing and only 1 guy shouting." Got to think about that for a minute. Perhaps when we're having a difficult time getting along with one another, we can say it goes back to our Jewish roots. But surely we can use these stories to help us understand the tradition that had happened at Corinth. The people yelled, the people fought, they slapped each other in the face, and they hit each other with their fists. They had a tradition of fighting among themselves. It sounds like they had 1 guy rowing and the rest shouting. Paul writes, "Now I appeal to you, brothers and sisters, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that all of you be in agreement and that there be no divisions among you, but that you be united in the same mind and the same purpose. For it has been reported to me by Chloe's people that there are quarrels among you, my brothers and sisters. What I mean is that each of you says, I belong to Paul, or I belong to Apollos, or I belong to Cephas, or I belong to Christ. Has Christ been divided? Was Paul crucified for you? Or were you baptized in the name of Paul? Paul asks these tough questions to a church in conflict. And conflict is so prevalent, isn't it? It seems that conflict is everywhere today. Yes, it's still in the church. It's in the workplace. It's even in our homes. Bill Cosby has a wonderful routine that always goes around on the internet. He says, whenever your kids are out of control, you can take comfort from the thought that even God's omnipotence did not extend to his kids. After creating heaven and earth, God created Adam and Eve. And the first thing he said to them was, don't. Don't what? Adam replied. Don't eat the forbidden fruit, God said. Forbidden fruit? Really? Where is it? Adam asked. It's over there, said God, wondering why he hadn't stopped after making the elephants. A few minutes later, God saw his kids having an apple break and he was angry. Didn't I tell you not to eat that fruit? The first parent asked. Uh-huh, Adam replied. Then why did you? I don't know, Adam answered. God's punishment, says Bill Cosby, was that Adam and Eve should have children of their own. Thus the pattern was set and it's never changed. But there's a reassurance in this story. If you've persistently and lovingly tried to give the children wisdom and they haven't taken it, don't be so hard on yourself. God had trouble handling children. What makes you think it would be a piece of cake for you? But conflict is part of life. At home, in the workplace, with our spouses, with our children. Early one morning, an Englishman was blasting away at a crop of brush on a grouse hunt. Suddenly, an outraged gentleman appeared and said, "See here, old man, you almost shot my wife with that volley." The hunter, properly shamed, replied, "So sorry, old chap. Here, have a go at mine over there." How do we deal with conflict? In the home, in the workplace, in the church, or wherever we may find it. This morning, let's consider 3 ways to help us work through conflict. First of all, in any conflict, try to see what the other person sees. All of us have our own perceptions of reality. When we're in conflict with another person, it may not be that they're trying to be difficult to get along with. They may actually see reality in a different way than we do. Leo Buscaglia tells of being aboard an airplane for a 5-hour flight from Los Angeles to New Jersey. When he took his aisle seat, it was obvious that the man next to him was irritated by his presence. He explained to Buscaglia that he hoped to have room to spread out. Within moments, they heard a baby cry. "Great," the man exclaimed under his breath. "I hate babies on airplanes. We'll have to listen to that child scream for 5 hours." When the stewardess stood to make her remarks to educate passengers about safety precautions, the traveler turned to Buscaglia and said, "I hate stewardesses. They're nothing but glorified waitresses hoping to meet rich men." She announced that lunch would be served mid-flight, which prompted the fellow to say to Buscaglia, "I hate airplane food. It's made from rubber." When she advised that there was an area at the rear of the plane for smokers, he said, "I hate smokers. They should be shot." Buscaglia replied, "All of them? I know some nice people who smoke." But the man replied with greater resolve, "I hate smokers, all of them." When at last the plane was airborne, the man turned to Buscaglia and asked, "What do you do?" Buscaglia answered, "I'm a professor." "Really? What do you teach?" "Educational psychology," Leo replied. "What's that exactly?" the fellow continued. To which Buscaglia answered, "Mostly I teach courses in relationships, how to treat one another, how to get along. Basically, I teach about love. The ornery traveler then responded with absolute sincerity, "I'm glad to meet someone who shares my values." It's not easy, but the first step in any conflict is to try to see the reality that the other person sees. This principle is stated another way by Stephen Covey. He says, first seek to understand, then seek to be understood. Try to understand, try to see the reality through the other person's eyes. And then second, put yourself in the other person's place. To do that, we have to listen to the other person. We have to identify with the other person. Now, normally, in the heat of conflict, our first response is to strike back. The Corinthians did that, and it never solved anything. It only escalated the battle. Notice the humility that Paul shows in this passage. Factions in the Corinthian church were forming around the various strong personalities in the New Testament church. Some were saying, "I belong to Paul." Others were saying, "I belong to Apollos," another fine teacher. Others said, "I belong to Cephas," which is the Greek name for Peter. Some were even saying, "Well, I belong to Christ," or "I belong to Christ," as if Christ was just another historical figure. But notice that Paul takes them all to task. First of all, his own fan club. "Has Christ been divided?" he asked. "Was Paul crucified for you? Or were you baptized in the name of Paul?" In a sense, Paul is identifying with members of the other factions to scold those who were united behind him in order that healing could take place for the whole community. Sometimes it's hard to identify with people who have very different views. Think of how we might identify with a teenage son or daughter. Oftentimes, their view of reality is in harsh contrast with our view of reality. Sometimes we remember too well what it was like to be a teenager. Yet we need to recall the pain of being a teenager too. We need to step back and clear our heads and clear our hearts and identify with that young person or that adult with whom we're in conflict. Perhaps we're not seeing what they're seeing. Perhaps we're not feeling what they're feeling. So we try to see their reality. We try to identify with them, and then we find a bridge. The only way to solve any tear in a relationship with another person is to match your reality with their reality until you find common ground. Unless your goal is to simply destroy your adversary and walk away, you're going to have to find an area of agreement. That agreement is so important. That agreement comes from the bridge we have in the cross of Christ. But so many people don't know that. So many people who do know the power of the cross forget it in those situations where bridge building is so greatly needed. One of those situations happened in 1994. A Korean jetliner crashed in the southern resort of Jeju while landing during a storm. What was going on inside was that the pilot and the co-pilot were arguing whether the runway was long enough. Then they fought each other for control of the aircraft as it touched down. This caused the aircraft to skid off the runway and hit into a safety barricade. Thankfully, all 152 passengers and 8 crew members survived by jumping down an escape chutes moments before the plane exploded in flames. But the pilot, Barry Edward Woods, and co-pilot Chung Chang-kyu continued their argument, blaming each other for the crash. They perished in that cockpit arguing about whose fault it was. Wow, conflict. Conflict causes problems, and here it was a big one. Unresolved conflict can bring down not only planes, but also companies and families and all kinds of important relationships. Somebody has got to be big enough. Somebody has got to be Christ-like enough to take the first step. Perhaps St. Paul, as he tried to intervene in the conflict in the Corinthian church, was thinking of the words of the Lord. So when you are offering your gift at the altar, if you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother or sister, and then come and offer your gift. Someone has to take the first step to build a bridge. Jesus did, and we're to be like him. It's interesting that despite all these horrible, horrible problems that are historically documented in the Corinthian church, that Paul doesn't criticize them. He doesn't point out or say bad things about any of their beliefs or any acts that the factions in the church were committing, except those of his own followers. All Paul criticizes is a spirit of disunity that tore at the church. And before he even went into a discussion of the problems in Corinth, he reminded them of their fellowship, their relationship, their calling, and their spiritual resources. You see, Paul was a bridge builder. So was Christ. Christ built the ultimate bridge, the bridge between ourselves and God. Christ's dream for all of us as his followers is that we will build bridges to others, whether they're in our own family, among our friends, in our workplace, or simply in our world. See what the other person sees. Walk a while in their shoes and feel what they feel, then build a bridge. Match your reality to their own. In May 2007, a young man in New York City went to the top of a building and threatened to jump off. He had a problem with his girlfriend, and he thought life wasn't worth living. However, something was different about this young man. He was deaf. Police tried using a loud bullhorn to send a message to him, but to no avail because he couldn't hear it. Fortunately, one policeman tried a different tactic. He had been a volunteer teacher of sign language in a deaf school. He went to the top of the building and by using sign language, talked the boy out of jumping. How was he able to reach him when the other policeman failed? He knew how to speak his language. We all know that communication is difficult. Not only communication from the pulpit, but communication in marriage, communication in the workplace, communication between cultures. Liz Curtis Higgs tells a humorous story about a woman named Eileen from Maine. Eileen longed for a little relief from the embarrassment she felt while visiting a school and orphanage in Kenya. Dozens of children who spoke only Swahili pressed around her, trying to see if the white of her skin would rub off. What took her back most was all the yelling. They kept yelling jumbo and super. Eileen grumbled to her interpreter, "I know I need to lose weight, but I didn't think I was so fat and large that they would yell jumbo and super at me." The interpreter burst out laughing, then explained, "In Swahili, jumbo means hello, and super means hello very much." Communication is difficult, but we have to find a way to communicate the power of the cross to all those around us, to our families, to our friends, and to the world. But communication is so hard, and so many times our messages are misread. Frankie ran home. No one could talk to the deaf young man until someone, that police officer, came who knew sign language. And we have to find ways like that to communicate with our world. We have to keep it simple and clear, but the message of the cross is plain. Very plain. It's the only way to be reconciled to God. But we face so many difficulties. I think of the story of a judge who was in court one day, and he handed his clerk a note that said, "Blind on right side may be falling. Please call someone." Understandably alarmed, the clerk called for help. While waiting for the help to come, he reassuringly whispered to the judge that the paramedics were on their way and would arrive shortly. Puzzled, the judge pointed to a sagging window blind on the right side of the courtroom and exclaimed, "I was thinking maybe you'd get someone from maintenance." Communication is difficult, but communication is critical, especially in this time and place. When we think of the failings of our time, How many marriages have failed because couples lost the ability to communicate? How many families are in distress because parents and their children can't talk to each other? How many hurting people would be helped if someone would simply take the time to communicate with them? Yes, communication is difficult, but it's critical if we are to live together in families and communities. And here's the punchline. See, all this talk about talking to one another, all this conflict, all of these things help us to forget what we need to remember, and that is the power of the cross. And it's that power, it's that message of the cross that we're to communicate as Christians. Telling others of the power of Christ, the power of the cross, is to be our main mission. Christ's final instruction to his disciples was, "Go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you." That's our task. That's our mission as believers of Jesus Christ. We're to communicate the good news. We're to share the message of the cross. And you may be thinking, well, I'm not a great communicator. I don't speak well. I don't know big words. But the best ways of communication require very few words at all. Listening is probably the best form of communication. Listening to your spouse, listening to your kids, listening to the concerns of your neighbor. We communicate by listening, and we communicate by the way we live. As the old saying goes, I'd rather see a sermon than hear one any day. That's the power of the cross. Jesus fulfills God's plan. We see a sermon, and we're called to live out a message. This message may be foolishness to those who are perishing, but to those who are being saved, it is the power of God. The important thing to realize is that you don't have to be a scholar to tell the good news of Jesus Christ. You don't have to be a person of great eloquence, education, or even intelligence. If you've experienced Christ's power in your life, tell it. If you have Christ's love in your heart, live it. It's the best way to share the message. It's the best way to share and to experience the power of the cross. Keep it simple. But let's change that KISS to keep it simple, saint. Because we all are saints, followers of Jesus Christ, sanctified by his blood. Keep it simple, saint. Tell everyone of the power of the cross. Amen.